While you're getting settled in, we don't want to start too late because there's so much wonderful conversation planned for today. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Of course, continue to get settled. We'll have people walking in. But hello, my name is Bridget Long, and I'm the Dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this important event. I hope that many of you were able to enjoy the Ask With Education Forum yesterday, focused on education, truth, and the future of democracy. And today we'll focus on defining the space of educational ethics. Before we get too far along, I'd like to recognize those who came before us in the space we share today. Harvard University is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past and present, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. As this land acknowledgement indicates, ethical questions have always been core to education, including here at Harvard. Harvard University's occupation of the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts is not an ethically neutral fact. Moreover, Harvard's entanglements with slavery and its legacies are also of profound ethical importance, as the university's initiative, Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery, makes clear. Let us also recognize the enslaved individuals who helped to build Harvard University and other colleges around the world. It is important to acknowledge the role these souls and communities played in creating and funding educational institutions that were not intended to serve them. Our history is filled with ethical questions and concerns that must not be ignored if we are to truly understand the present, and they are deeply intertwined with education. This is part of the reason I'm so excited about this conference, Educational Ethics, a field-launching conference. I also take pride that the Harvard Graduate School of Education is the site of this conference because of our commitment to strengthening education as a profession. One mark of a profession is that it have an ethical core, one that is both shared within the profession and recognized outside the profession. Medicine has the Hippocratic Oath. Lawyers are ethically committed to upholding the law, and in the US, the Constitution in particular. And the core of journalistic ethics is the pursuit and publication of the truth. But while all of us working in education feel a special obligation to students and their well-being, and there's a great deal of scholarship about the aims and ethical dimensions of education, this hasn't yet coalesced into a clear ethical North Star in our field. There's no equivalent of the Hippocratic Oath for teachers, school board members, or secretaries of education. So that's why I'm proud to be hosting this conference to support the professionalization of education and this collective thought-building community through the creation of a new field of educational ethics. This commitment to professionalization also aligns with so much of our work here at HGSE to try to help strengthen education as a profession. Most recently, we have focused on redesigning our master's degree, and central to that effort has been to define and require a set of foundations courses: how people learn, leading change, evidence, and equity and opportunity. The fourth foundations course, Equity and Opportunity, reflects our core belief that all education professionals should recognize and grapple with the role that values and ethical principles play in their work and in the field more generally. At a time of turmoil and division about the aims and practices of education, I'm proud of Harvard's continued commitment to scholarship and teaching about education foundations and to integrating this work with research, practice, and policy. This is a long tradition at HGSE of interdisciplinary work in moral development, as well as serious scholarship on the philosophy of education. Nonetheless, we recognize that there's more work to be done, perhaps now more than ever. So I'm grateful to the many researchers and practitioners and scholars from around the globe who are here today. I'm grateful in seeing some of our alumni come back, seeing our faculty here to engage on this topic. So I'm also incredibly thankful for those who are going to be participating on some of the presentations and panels that are coming up. But I have to say that I'm especially appreciative of the leadership and persistence of my colleague and friend, Mira Levinson, the Juliana W. and William Foss Thompson Professor of Education and Society at HGSE. For those of you who know Mira, she is a force of nature. And this conference was actually supposed to happen 3 years ago, but unfortunately we had a little something called COVID. But she has really been highlighting the role of educational ethics, demonstrating the importance of grappling with the topic, and then bringing us together for this conference. So thank you so much, Mira. So I now welcome Mira to the stage to provide more framing for the conference.
Many thanks, Bridget, for those really generous and inspiring opening remarks. I want to thank you as well for all the support that you and the Dean's Office and our colleagues around HGSE and Harvard have offered to make this happen. Here at HGSE, I particularly want to thank our operations, IT, sponsored projects, and communications and marketing departments, as well as my faculty coordinator, Charisse Kenner, and the amazing EdEthics team who you have met today, probably many of you have heard from, Communications and Outreach Associate Nisha Srinivasa, Curriculum Specialist Sarah O'Brien, and the extraordinary Liz Block, whose title as EdEthics Director of Strategy, Partnerships, and Outreach suggests the breadth of her contributions, but even so captures only about a tenth of what she does day to day. This conference really would not be taking place without her. So I'm going to ask that we give her a round of applause. I also want to thank the Edmond and Lily Safra Center for Ethics here at Harvard, which has provided invaluable financial and in-kind support, both when this conference was scheduled to take place in May 2020 and again this year. In addition to expressing my gratitude to Executive Director Jess Miner and all the staff at the center, I want to acknowledge Jacob Fay, who back in 2019 to 2020, as a Safra Center postdoctoral fellow, helped me conceptualize and organize this conference the first time around. He also worked with Harry Brighouse and Randall Curran that year to bring the graduate workshop into being, which actually did take place on Zoom 3 years ago. And I'm so pleased that almost all of the then graduate fellows, and now many of whom are in faculty positions of their own, are able to join us today. So that's really great. And then finally, I want to thank the organizing committee, for which this is in fact our final conference in a 6-conference series sponsored very generously by the Spencer Foundation, spanning over a decade. I'm really grateful to Harry Brighouse, Randy Curran, Harvey Siegel, Michael Hand, Rob Reish, and Larry Blum, as well as Eamon Callan and the late Stephen Norris in the first round, and Sigal Ben Parath in the second round, for their colleagueship in organizing these conferences, and again to Spencer for funding them. Former Spencer President Michael McPherson was also essential for making this initiative possible. The first 3 conferences brought together philosophers of education with mainstream philosophers. The next 2 conferences brought together philosophers of education into conversation with social scientists. And I hope that this final conference channels the promise of those 2 initiatives while also bringing other scholars from the humanities and the professions, current educators and educational leaders, and policymakers and activists into the collective conversation. All right, so what is this final conference or collective conversation that John, Nima, and Sigal kicked off so brilliantly last night, and that we're gathering to continue for the next 2 days? As you all know, we've described it rather boldly as a field launching conference for educational ethics, and that raises some crucial questions, right? Like including, aren't there a lot of people working on ethical questions in education already? Why do we need a separate field of educational ethics? And what is educational ethics anyway? I'm going to punt on the last question, what is educational ethics? Because in many ways, that's the question that I'm hoping that our panelists are going to help us think through over the next 2 days. And I'm going to come back later to the first connected question, what about all the work that exists already in educational ethics? Let me start instead with the second question, why the absence of the field matters. What we don't see in the world, given its absence, and what we might see in the world if a field of educational ethics did exist. I'm going to do so by comparison with bioethics, a field that is itself only 60 years old, but whose influence and institutionalization at this point is undeniable. In fact, it is now unimaginable for bioethics not to exist, despite the fact that, and this is hard to believe, but it is true, no one had ever heard of it. There was not even a term for it in 1959. I think that's really important to keep in mind. So let me use the past 3 years, COVID times, as the basis for this comparison. So during COVID, a lot of ethical questions arose very quickly in public health, biomedical research, and medical practice. For example, what principles should guide the distribution of PPE or of ventilators under conditions of scarcity? When should lockdowns be imposed? For how long? And at what cost? And to whom? Should people be punished for violating quarantine restrictions? And if so, how? Should healthy adults be permitted to volunteer for human challenge trials, exposing themselves to COVID to test novel vaccines or other treatments? Who should be prioritized to receive the first vaccines, those who were medically most vulnerable or essential workers? Should residents of countries that could afford to stockpile vaccines receive a booster before residents of other countries received even a first vaccine? Should people who refuse to be vaccinated be restricted from public spaces or services? I could go on for a long time, right? But I won't. That's a range. These questions were, and in some cases remain, highly contested. But one thing that was consistent about them is that they were recognized as being questions about ethics, in addition to there being questions about science, about medicine, politics, policy formation, and so forth. They're not only questions about ethics, but they were recognized as having an ethical dimension. And so when expert panels and stakeholder groups were convened to weigh in on these decisions, bioethicists were consistently included. It would not have occurred to anyone to convene a panel to discuss vaccination priority, criteria, or trial guidelines that did not include at least one bioethicist. There was a similarly lengthy list of ethical questions bedeviling educators and educational leaders and policymakers over the same period of time. For example, when should schools be closed to in-person learning? For how long? And at what cost? To whom? If in-person learning could be provided to only a small subset of students, who should get priority and why? Should students be graded for work they were assigned when schools were closed? Should failing grades be banned? Should all students receive A's? Should absences count? How, if at all, should parents' preferences for in-person versus virtual schooling be weighed in determining district-level policies? And since parents' preferences here in the United States often differed by race and class, and not coincidentally by their vulnerability to infection, what principles should guide districts' decisions about whose preferences to satisfy? What level of risk should teachers be expected to assume in order to enable the reopening of in-person schooling? How about college professors? Should private schools and colleges serving wealthy students be allowed to reopen if they could do so safely because of their larger campuses, up-to-date ventilation, and smaller class sizes, even while public schools and community colleges in the same communities remain closed because of the health risks? Should universities be required to continue providing remote attendance options to accommodate students with disabilities once COVID proved it was possible? When is it okay for schools to go back to normal and to treat students as if their lives are normal too? How about to treat teachers as if their lives are normal? Again, I could go on for a long time, but I'll stop there. These are also essentially ethical questions, in addition to there being questions about learning, child development, politics, economics, policy formation, and so forth. Again, they aren't only ethical, but they are ethical. But among the policymaking bodies and expert stakeholder groups discussing school and university reopenings and closings, changes in attendance, grading, and graduation criteria, etc., I know of only two that intentionally included educational ethicists. One was convened by Harvard University professor Danielle Allen through her leadership of the COVID-19 Rapid Response Initiative at the Edmond and Lily Safra Center for Ethics here at Harvard. The other was convened by Harvard Chan School of Public Health professor Joe Allen and the task force that he led on safe work, safe schools, and safe travel as part of the Lancet COVID-19 Commission. I'm grateful to them both. But otherwise, I know of no superintendents, school boards, college leadership councils, governors, or secretaries or ministers of education who said, we need an educational ethicist to help us design our policies and make these decisions. Right? I know that many of us in the room probably reached out to our local superintendents, school boards, state secretaries of education, et cetera. And some of us may have been successful in getting to talk to them. But that initiative on our part is frankly different from the initiative that we've seen of leaders in reaching proactively out to the bioethicists to say, we need you. And I don't know of much proactive reaching out and saying, we need an educational ethicist here. This isn't surprising. There are few, if any, degrees in educational ethics, though kudos to Ohio State for offering a graduate certificate. There are few, if any, job postings for educational ethicists, and virtually no one actually identifies as an educational ethicist. Well, until now, I hope. By contrast, bioethicists have all of these things in spades. Right? As I already noted, bioethicists are consistently recognized as stakeholders with relevant, important expertise in policy-setting bodies at all levels of government, as well as in international bodies such as the World Health Organization and the UN, and by NGOs like Doctors Without Borders. Partners in Health, in fact, another NGO was recently hiring a bioethics and global health equity associate. They are regularly invited to serve on blue ribbon panels, deliberative bodies, and the like. Through collaborative interdisciplinary scholarship and membership in these kinds of policy bodies, bioethicists have also helped to create metrics like the Quality Adjusted Life Year, or QALY, and the Disability Adjusted Life Year, or DALY. These metrics are consistently used by policymakers to decide everything from whether to build a primary or tertiary care facility to whether to cover new cancer treatment costs. Bioethicists have had similarly important impact on policy decisions from defining death to regulating gene editing research to advising on organ transplant policies. In addition to participating in policy deliberation and design, many bioethicists also play important clinical roles. Clinical bioethicists are directly employed or retained as consultants by many public health departments and virtually every major hospital, where on-call clinical ethics teams are available to consult with medical staff, families, and hospital administrators, often on a same-day or 24-hour basis. Sometimes medical providers are required to call in bioethicists, but more often bioethicists are called in voluntarily. They may be called in ahead of time to help a department or a clinician think through an ethical choice or dilemma that they face, or they may be called in real time to help mediate a conflict, say among clinicians or between medical providers and guardians for vulnerable patients. In this latter case, when clinical bioethicists are serving as mediators, They tend not to offer their own judgment about more or less ethical pathways to action. Rather, they use their bioethical expertise to listen to the different parties and then reframe their claims in ways that highlight the values and principles that seem to be important to each as a means of helping the group reach consensus about how to move forward. Both policy-oriented bioethicists and clinical bioethicists are able to do their work in part because of the efflorescence of bioethics scholarship. Some of it fundamental theory building, some of it designed directly to address policy and practice relevant questions, and a lot of it in the mushy but still useful middle. This scholarship is made possible because philosophy departments, medical schools, and public health schools have regular tenure lines in bioethics, as do many law schools, public policy schools, religion departments, and nursing schools. The NIH offers bioethics fellowships for law, medicine, and philosophy graduates, as well as other disciplines, further supporting academic training, identity development, and scholarship that is tightly tied to field-based questions. So let's turn back to educational ethics, because that's the work that calling this a field launching is trying to do. I hope that by launching a field of educational ethics, we will help to make it as common sense in 2050 that educational ethicists are included in deliberation about teacher evaluation policies or special education funding, as it is common sense now in 2023 that bioethicists are included in deliberations about kidney distribution priorities and prenatal gene editing. By 2050, I hope that it is perceived as obvious that education schools, public policy schools, law schools, and philosophy departments would have tenure lines set aside for educational ethicists, just as it is obvious that philosophy departments, medical schools, and public health programs would support bioethics research today. And by 2050, I hope that teachers and professors, school principals and university provosts, PTA presidents, central office administrators, school boards, Head Start directors, charter network CEOs, learning technology providers, after-school partners, and even students think that it is totally natural that they could call on clinical educational ethicists for consultation or mediation whenever they face an ethical dilemma or conflict that they feel ill-equipped to resolve on their own. Imagine if Teach for All, the Boston Public Schools, UNESCO, the Gates and Walton Foundations, the California Community College and State University System, the College Board, and state and national departments or ministries of education each had educational ethicists on staff, not for reasons of compliance or box ticking, but because they recognize the need for and usefulness of such expertise. What might it look like to live in a world where school districts bring ethicists into the conversation as they wrestle with changes to selective school admissions policies, with questions about whether to reduce or expand the presence of uniformed police officers in schools, or with how to respond to racially disparate attendance patterns? What might it feel like to have discussions about for-profit, low-fee private schools in developing countries and incentive pay for teachers that were honest about the ethical complexity of these decisions, rather than serving simply as opportunities to see who could climb to the highest moral ground so as to be best positioned to throw rocks on those below? And what might our own politics look like today, in 2023, if we had serious conversations about the complicated ethics, histories, and practices attached to principles such as parental rights, child protection, democratic control of schools, student voice, teacher professionalism, and academic freedom. I'm assuming you can fill in the, real-time policy relevance of those concepts. This question brings us back, in fact, to the first question that I posed, but then punted on. Aren't there a lot of people working on ethical questions in education already, including on such topics as parental rights, safety, democratic education, teacher judgment, and academic freedom? The answer, of course, is yes, right? Like many of you in this room and many, really, there's a 2,500 plus year history of such work, starting perhaps with Plato's Republic and the Confucian Analects and Shuiji, moving through Locke, Kant, Rousseau, and Wollstonecraft to Du Bois, Oakeshott, Dewey, Noddings, Green, Kohlberg, Friedman, Freire, Gutmann, Sizer, Boal, Elmore, Foucault, Biesta, Ladson-Billings, Darling-Hammond, and thousands more. I say thousands because you'll note, for those of you for whom those last names made sense, that I named intellectual leaders from a number of different fields and professional positions, not just philosophers, but also political scientists, sociologists, psychologists, anthropologists, historians, economists, educators, university presidents, policy makers, artists, and activists. We do not lack for commitment, passion, or intellectual firepower when we think about people who care about issues of educational ethics. Just look at the amazing program of the people who are going to be speaking up on this stage today and tomorrow. But we don't yet have the collective identity, visibility, or institutional roles to bring this intellectual work to fruition in the world. Nor, frankly, have we always done the kind of work that those on the ground need to support their ethical reflection and practice. So that brings me back to the purpose of this conference, to build our collective capacity through naming, defining, and starting to shape an interdisciplinary, multi-perspectival, and inclusive field of educational ethics. I frankly hope that you feel a sense of occasion over the next 2 days. I'm going to be really, open about this. And I really hope that 10 or 20 or 40 years from now, depending on your age, you feel a sense of pride in saying to others, oh yes, I was there, here in this room or virtually. I was at that field launching conference at Harvard. That was me. I helped to create this field. That's what I want each of you to feel, because that's what will help create this identity and this visibility and help us define this field together so that it can have impact out in the world. So how are we going to do that together today and tomorrow? Well, in the way that academics do, and I will say, I don't think that solely having a conference is going to launch this field, right? So let me make it clear. It's not like we're one and done, right? But this is, I think, an important feature of launching a field, is to be able to have collective conversation. Up here on stage, all around this room, and online when we invite question and answer, and even maybe do some turn-in talks. Over lunch, informally, and at the round tables, and I think there are still a few lunch tickets available. Is that right? Great. If you want to sign up during the break. And then also during the lengthy breaks that we've scheduled between each session. It is intentional that we have 25 or 30 minutes between each session, because a lot of the work that we do together is through making connections with one another, through processing together, through coming up with schemes together. And so much of the work of this conference is going to happen over coffee, over lunch, et cetera, as you walk around Harvard Square, if it ever gets sunny, as much as it's going to happen in this room. So we really want you to take advantage of that. And then finally, we've designed the intellectual arc of the panels to help with this collective field shaping. So as Bridget mentioned, today is really focused on thinking about what does this field mean and look like? How do we define it, right? So we're going to start off with a question, a really basic question of what is educational ethics? How does it play out? Why aren't we at the stage of actually having the kind of impact that we should? And what might it take us to get there? And what are people grappling with? We're then going to move on to two partner panels thinking about how does educational ethics relate to other ethical thinking. So the first is going to think about educational ethics in relationship to childhood ethics. How much, when we think about educational ethics, are we thinking about children, the state of childhood, et cetera? How much are we thinking about other stuff altogether, institutions, structures, organizations? And then after lunch, and I do want to say there are amazing roundtables at lunch, so please do look at those and think about attending them. After lunch, we're going to think about educational ethics in relation to other social structures, right? The economy, politics, culture, et cetera. And what does it mean to try to carve out an area of educational ethics, given that so much in education is shaped by forces outside of education? And then we'll end today by coming back actually to this comparison with bioethics and with other professional ethics that Bridget teed us up with in her opening remarks, and hear from people who are experts in bioethics, tech ethics, legal ethics, journalistic ethics, all sorts of ethics, and thinking about how have professional ethics in those fields been effective ways of shaping a profession and having impact, and where have they gone astray? Because I will say, let me be totally honest, I gave a very rosy picture of bioethics in my talk, right? And we all know that there is a much less rosy picture also to offer. And so we'll sort of think about what is the role of professional ethics in other fields as we think about educational ethics as a professional field. And then tomorrow, we'll dive into three specific sort of substantive areas of educational ethics that there has also been work in, but frankly, I'm hoping to inspire more work in, so that's why we set up these panels. And we're going to think about educational ethics in the digital age. And that's obviously come to the fore very recently with ChatGPT, et cetera, but it has also a much longer history and so forth. We will think about educational ethics in relation to rationing and triage, which interestingly was actually one of the panels we had set up for 2020, and it seemed quite outre at the time, but now that we've gone through 3 years of COVID, I think that rationing and triage seems more, centrally relevant to education as well. And then we'll finish up by thinking beyond the state, family, and student triangle about sort of power in education to think about other kinds of organizations, such as large philanthropy, teachers' unions, textbook publishers, et cetera, in shaping education policy and practice and how we think about the ethics of those kinds of influences. So that's our arc for the next 2 days. It's a field launching, so we're hoping to start this. This is not the end, but I really hope that you will stay with us for this and then take this out into the world and do stuff with it.